Hey y'all, this is just my thoughts and my experience this summer with the YSS kit on the Trail 125. I'd recorded some video of the install and I was going to post that. Well, I wanted to preview that with this little bit. Right off the bat, my fork was kind of clunky and seemed to bottom really easily. I just kind of chalked it up as a quirk of the bike. So I bought the YSS kit, I think that first month. I didn't see any other options out there, just assumed it would be an upgrade, and rode it all summer long and was never really happy with it. It didn't really bottom any less, frankly. And so kind of had this long journey, summer long review, if you will, of the kit and how it performed. And what I ended up doing, I ended up going back to the stock spring, is I took the forks completely out of the bike to install the kit. But if you're watching this video to see that process, I can save you a lot of trouble and tell you definitively, you do not have to remove the fork from the bike to install the YSS kit. All you need is a magnet. This happens to be a Blue Point I bought many years ago, pretty strong. But all you have to do is take the top cap off and pull the components out with a magnet. No brainer, right? So I didn't point out that this is a telescoping magnet. It's quite long, but you don't need anything this long to get the stock components out. If you can kind of visualize, your spring's going to sit down here. It comes to about here or so, and then you've got a little washer, and then you've got the spring spacer itself underneath the cap. So to remove the stock stuff, a magnet, 10, 12 inches long would probably do it, something like that. But I wanted to point out is if you install the YSS stuff and ever want to remove it with a magnet, keep in mind that besides the spacer, washer, and spring, you've also got the little PD valve all the way down here in the bottom. So to remove that with a magnet, you're going to need something quite long to reach almost down to the very end. So food for thought. The only thing I had to do when I decided to do that was get the bars out of the way. The spring's going to pull out, so you got to get the bars out of the way. I just loosened mine and set them up here and had total access to it. Very simple. I mean, it saves you, I was going to say half the time, but it's even less than that. It's really quick, and taking the forks off is, pretty involved. The wheel, the brake, getting the tubes out of the trees. I did film it as well. I just don't see the point of posting it because you don't need to do it. Also learned this little tidbit, just, learn as you go, that the Allen bolt on the bottom is a drain bolt. So you can drain your fluid. Once you install these preload adjusters, I started with them all the way out, obviously, and just barely touching the top of the spring. What I ended up doing over time, every ride I'd go on, I'd just put a turn or maybe a turn and a half. I put a mark on the top of them and counted my rotations, kept a 10 millimeter wrench in my pocket, and every time I'd stop, I'd just put a little more preload on them. And quickly lost track of how many revolutions and blah, 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 as you do. So I ended up just kind of tracking it by the anodized red lines, and I just match them left to right. But long story short is I got all the way to the top. And so I went through the whole range of adjustment. And what I would say is roughly about halfway through this travel of this thing, this fork gets noticeably stiffer, more so than any point up to there. It just all of a sudden seems to get really kind of hard. Like, for example, going down the road, it's just more jarring. It's kind of hard to describe, but it seems to get stiffer but not better, if that's understandable, if that makes sense. It didn't bottom any less, is the moral of the story. So even cranked, I was still getting bottoming. And all I can think of, and as I said in the other video, I'm not an engineer. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about most of the time. I think what's happening partially is the more you compress the spring, you're losing travel out of the spring, right? You're compressing all those coils, so there's less travel to work with. And I think that's why it's still bottoming. Here's the YSS kit next to the stock components. I got both forks completely disassembled and drained. YSS kit here on the top, and stock components here. Biggest difference you'll notice when you get it is the addition of this valve. They call it the PD valve. Installs at the bottom here of the spring. This is the bottom of the fork. Stock setup doesn't have this. Mine came taped into the packaging like so with this spacer on the valve. I'll point out more in a minute why I'm mentioning that. The spring is different in a couple of ways. It is slightly longer, the YSS spring. And initially I thought it wasn't wound quite as tight. But if you look at it, the gap between the coils is a little bit bigger than the stock spring. But the more I stared at it, I realized what it is that the wire diameter of the YSS spring is a smaller diameter than the stock spring. Put some calipers on it to confirm, and what I got was, and these are rough, I don't know how accurate it is, but 116 for the YSS spring and 126 for the stock spring. So that's a difference. The YSS spacer is shorter than the stock spacer, and that would most likely, I'm assuming, would be to take up the additional length of the valve and possibly the additional length of the spring. The spacer is a little bit interesting, just to be a Honda fanboy here for a minute. You can see the seam in this tubing, but if you compare it to what you get out of the Honda fork, it's truly a seamless piece of tubing. It's higher quality. It's been chamfered inside and out, a little extra attention to detail. The other big difference is the end caps of the stock versus the YSS. The stock obviously doesn't have the preload adjusters, but the bigger difference, or big as difference, is the stock caps are steel and the YSS caps are aluminum. And I don't know how big a deal that is. It's, to me, Honda spec'd steel for a reason, and for me that's almost enough said. I don't know if this is going to be a problem long term. I personally would prefer to pay a few more dollars and get steel. I would imagine that's part of it, or if not most of it, is that this might be easier to manufacture, cheaper to manufacture in aluminum versus steel. But it's I think it's a bit of a shortcut myself. How they'll hold up long term, who knows? I would guess this is sort of a set and forget. Once you torque it down, set your preload, you may never touch it again. Might be fine. You know, obviously being softer material, the more times you remove it, more times you put a wrench on the end of it or socket, the more susceptible it could be to rounding and stripping, but time will tell. When you look at this kit and you look at these, you wonder if you couldn't just install this, if you could find these, maybe somebody will make them, and just install this in the stock fork and increase the preload on the stock spring and improve the fork massively. At least for my needs, I just want it a little stiffer. But I didn't see these offered separately. I didn't search very hard for that, but maybe they are, but might be a lot cheaper option to just try these with the stock spring if it was at all possible. So the other issue I've ran into, or question mark I should say, is regarding this spacer and the spacer that came on the valve. I notice the instructions show a washer between the spring and the spacer. This washer does belong here between the spring and the spacer. All fine and dandy, makes a lot of sense until you get into these instructions. It does show one there. It does not show one down there on the PD valves. So you take all that to mean this washer was probably just put here for a shipping convenience, and it actually belongs up here between the spring and the spacer. So I was fine with that until I read this note here. And this is regarding this valve. So this is regarding this valve. And it says if you use the PD valve spacer assembly, the spacer to PD fork valve before assembly to the front fork I've read this 100 times, and the only thing I can assume that means is that this spacer goes on this valve. It says the spacer to PD fork valve before assembly to the fork. The parts diagram does not back that up at all. So that's a bit of a mystery. Not sure what that means. Also, it says if use this valve spacer, which makes you think maybe you don't even need to use that. Subject for another conversation, I guess. It shows a diagram of it here too, and also doesn't show that I can see. Doesn't show a washer in there either. So I'm not sure what this note means. Everything else on the instructions would tell you there is no spacer there, but I don't know how it's to interpret that. There's nowhere in the instructions does it tell you how much fluid to use. It does say check the level and recommended by the manual online. I haven't checked that. They may have it posted there, so it shouldn't be too hard on them. But I did see a comment on a Waro's channel regarding this kit. Someone commented that those are your numbers, 185 mil or 120 cc's. 185 meaning from the top of the fork, 185 mils. So that's easy to do. Shouldn't be a problem. On the topic of oil, they do ship you with 15 weight. I think that's something to ponder myself. I wasn't unhappy with the damping of the fork, and I would hate to over dampen it with thicker fluid. I do have this old 10 weight Honda, and it looks and smells exactly like what came out of the fork, which I've Googled ATF weight, and what I read is that it is basically a 10 weight oil, and once again assuming it's an ATF. So that's something to consider. I don't know how hard this would be to experiment with oil changes. The only other fitting on the fork is down here at the bottom. So after more thought about this regarding the contradiction with the spacer, what I decided to try is, if you recall, is the confusion about whether you have a spacer here, and here, or just one here. I actually translated the Thai verbiage here, hoping I'd get some insight. Didn't really help. This is actually better, but still confusing. So that's the difference it makes if you install both the spacer in the kit above the PD valve and the spacer from your old application between the spring tube spacer and the spring itself. This one. So that's basically with both spacers in. This one is just with the center spacer in and no spacer on the PD valve. So, and I guess this was already obvious, basically what that spacer would do, for one thing, would increase the preload. So you can see as soon as you thread it in, you're already preloaded right away, sooner than you are here. I'm going to go with this option and the 10 weight oil, and we'll see how she rides. I think it's really, I've overthought the entire thing. If you were to just look at this, install them, you wouldn't be asking yourself this question. It's just simply that note that kind of threw me off on a wild goose chase. I think it's going to be similar either way because you've got the adjustment on the preload adjuster. So you're not giving away any preload. I think you'd probably be able to overcome all this additional preload on this fork with the adjuster, if that makes sense. So hope that's helpful. Sorry for all the additional detail. I tend to overthink everything and scrutinize things more than I should. So what I ended up doing initially is I installed this 10 weight Honda I had laying around, which seems to be pretty much the same as what came out of it. It smells the same, feels the same. Ran that maybe a few rides, and then I decided to try this stuff and was much happier. The reason I never used this stuff was because I'm an idiot and somehow did not realize that milliliters and cc's are the same thing. I don't know what I did wrong, but I somehow converted it at the time and got it in my mind that that this wasn't enough for both forks, which in fact it is exactly enough with 10 milliliters to spare. So that's why I did that. This probably works fine, I just didn't try it. So as a quick summary to all this, I apologize if this video is a little disjointed. This was originally done, I installed this kit in March or April of 2021. It's now January of 22. But just to summarize it for me is at the end of all this you've watched, what I ended up doing, as I've said, I put the stock spring back in to the fork because I was not happy with the clunking noise. The stock spring, in my opinion, performs better. I left these caps in, as I mentioned in the video, and as I theorized in my original install, I thought that's something you might be able to do, and you can. Seems to work pretty well. Just last night as I was editing this video, Daniel from Thailand, he's got a channel on YouTube as well. Thank you, Daniel, for this information. He mentioned if you add fluid to the fork, a little more fluid, you can get rid of the clunking noise. I have not tried that. When I changed out the 10 weight from the 15 and noticed it was a big improvement, I had that thought, but I didn't want to blow the seals, so I just left it at the 120 cc level, which is what I found was the recommended amount. So along that same comment with what Daniel pointed out with adding more fluid is, I hope to not be too long-winded here, but during the course of all this research I did on this kit, also within Ride with Woro's channel, there's a post from somebody that had also installed the kit, and he mentioned the PD valve not performing correctly because it's not getting enough fluid from the stock piston. His comment was to drill some holes. He bought new pistons, drilled holes in them, I think 3 holes, 1/64th, I think, and the idea being that it allows more fluid to flow to the PD valve and allows the PD valve to do what it's designed to do. So I have not done that. So I'm not trying to bash YSS here and say their product sucks, but I would still go back on that and say, why do you have to alter the stock fork to make their product perform? And all I'm telling all of you here is my installation with the amount of fluid they recommended, with the full adjustment that they give you on their preload adjusters, doesn't perform well. I am now curious to know if more fluid would also allow the PD valve to perform better. That's a question mark I have now after getting to the very end of editing this video. But once again, if that needs to be done, then they should spec it accordingly. I will add that while you're writing it, at least while I was writing it with the YSS components installed in it, I could hear what I think is the PD valve making noise. It's kind of like a mouse squeaking noise, kind of when the fork goes through its cycle, which very well could be the PD valve being starved of fluid or cavitating, I think is the term, and not performing the way it's designed to do. But once again, if that's the case, then it's the kit that they're selling us has not been spec correctly to perform without additional modifications. And I think that's my whole point here with the kit. I feel like I'm doing R&D on this thing to try this, try that. It seems a little silly to me. You buy it out of the box and you expect it to work. The customer service that I received was non-existent. I couldn't find out any information. They wouldn't respond to my emails. I'm not being paid by YSS to do R&D. I just expected it to work, and my feeling is that it doesn't work very well. I hope it's helpful, I think, as well as my thoughts, being completely non-authoritative on the subject. The market itself is changing constantly. I just saw a post on Facebook that someone else is offering a preload cap. It didn't look like it had adjustability though. It just looked like it was a deeper cap just to put more preload on the spring, which isn't bad. The price to me was not a whole lot. I can't remember. It didn't seem like it was a lot less than the YSS kit itself. I think as designed, it's pretty well thought out. And this constant need to improve and do things different, a little bit tiresome for me after a while. It's the bottom line here for me is, how deep do you want this rabbit hole to go? At some point, I feel like you cut your losses and just accept the bike for what it is. On the flip side, it is a lot of fun to tinker with, and I totally understand that as well. For me personally, I'm going to leave it as it is for now, right at the spring as it is. I am going to add some more fluid to the fork, see if that gets rid of the clunking, and I'm definitely going to do some improvements on the seat, and we will go from there. I appreciate you watching. I hope any of this is helpful. Let me know if you have questions or comments, and happy riding.